here with us today. And as you just saw, this webinar will be recorded. So please keep muted throughout the webinar. As Patty mentioned, you can enter any questions in the chat box. And as Patty mentioned, we will be sending out a copy of this presentation deck, as well as the recording of the webinar for you to reference. So just keep in mind that you'll have a copy of that. So to get started, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Layla Davini, and I am essentially job advisor, employment services advisor in the Western region with UpGlow. So we serve candidates in California and Washington. I myself sit in the California kind of branch. And now I'll ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, and let's start with Tamar. Tamar, if you could please introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Layla. We're so looking forward to this webinar. I'm Tamar Frolickstein-Appel. I too am a healthcare job advisor, job coach. I sit in the New York office. No, I sit in the Chicago office. And I'm happy to see everyone here. And I'm also head of the National Healthcare Community.
Thank you, Tamar. And Patty, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure, absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Patty. I am working in the Eastern region as a job coach or employment service advisor. And I served job seekers in DMV, and our office is in Washington, D.C. I'm excited to be here. And yeah, welcome, everyone.
Thank you. And finally, Kiri.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Layla, for this webinar today. My name is Kiri Philbrook, and I'm also an employment services advisor and job coach serving the Eastern region, and I'm based in New York City.
Perfect. Thank you. So today we're going to be discussing how to address gaps in experience during job interviews and how to address being overqualified in interviews. So the way that we're going to approach this is in two separate kind of segments. So the first segment will be us discussing how to address gaps in experience, followed by how to address being overqualified. And I really encourage you to please enter any questions you have in the chat. I'm hoping in the last 10 to 15 minutes that will be reserved just for you asking those questions and for all of us advisors to give you some answers if we did not cover questions you had in the presentation itself. So I encourage you to enter those in the chat so we can take them at the end. Okay, so to start off with, we're going to first discuss how to address gaps in experience during job interviews. So you may be thinking initially, right, what is a gap in experience? What defines it? How do I know if I have a gap in my experience? So a gap in employment is when you have gone a period of months or years in which you've been unemployed. Generally, when we think of a gap of experience that you need to be a little more prepared to discuss, it's a gap that's 6 months or longer. So if, for example, you have not held a job for a month or 2 or 3, that's really not something, that we would really consider a gap. A gap is more 6+ months of unemployment. So there's so many different reasons for people who have, gaps on their resume. And some of these reasons that we commonly see in working with our wonderful candidates at UpGlow include caring for children or family members. That can be, very valid reason that people have taken time away from their careers, from their jobs. This may also involve waiting on work authorization if, this person is unable to work in the US for a certain period of time while they got that. That's a very valid reason, and a reason that you may have a gap of experience on your resume. moving to a new country, that process may take time. It's certainly difficult to pack up and move, to an entirely different country and really kind of get settled in. So that may also be a cause. Next, studying for licensing or certification exams, for classes or courses. A lot of folks take time just to focus on this and may take time out of the workforce, out of a job, right? Just to focus on this full time. And then lastly, a common cause in the US for someone having a gap on their resume is that they were laid off or fired from a job, especially if it was very sudden and they did not have time to plan ahead and to start searching for another job. If it happens suddenly, that can definitely cause a gap of experience on someone's resume. And it really varies by industry, but it can take months to find a new job, to really put in those job applications, right? And to wait to hear back. So that can be another reason for a gap in experience. These are only some of the reasons, some of the most common ones. There are others out there, but I just wanted to kind of capture some reasons that people may have a gap of experience. So moving on, how would you address a gap in employment in interviews? And the first thing I really wanted to discuss here is to be truthful. You do not need to make up a reason to cover up for why you've been out of the field. But you also don't need to give details on specific reasons. So you can be very broad and general without giving too much detail on why or what exactly you've been doing in the personal sense, if it's personal, right? So a good example of this is if you took some time off to move to a different country, maybe you had to care for some family members, maybe there were some other personal kind of issues going on. You do not need to let the interviewer know the details of those personal issues, but rather keep it broad and say something more along the lines of, I immigrated to the United States and I took some time off to care for family. And so being broad, but yet being truthful. The next point, what did you do during that time that may have been related to your profession especially? So if you volunteered inside or outside your profession, that's very valuable to mention. It's very appreciated by employers. If you took courses or earned a certification or license, that's another great point to discuss. If you kept up to date in your field somehow, or just professionally, you can also discuss that. So maybe you joined a professional group, an association, maybe you did some self-study, maybe you read up on some academic journals or interesting topics. Those are all very valid things that you can discuss and that I would encourage you to discuss, to take the focus away from the gap and really focus more on what you've been doing that is related to your field or in volunteering, how you spent your time during that gap. You also want to emphasize that you are ready to return to work in a very confident and positive way. So really at the end of your response, I think it is very beneficial to really emphasize the fact that you are now ready to return. You're, eager to return to your career path. And, when you're discussing the answer as a whole, you don't want to seem down or have a more kind of negative tone. You really want to be positive and try to, exude confidence, because it lets the interviewer really know that you are ready, and you shift the focus away from the gap more onto what you've been doing in the meantime. Okay, so thinking ahead, So now that we've kind of discussed how to address this type of question in an interview, I wanted to take some time to present a few ideas if you have a gap on your resume of how you can take action now in order to position yourself really well in your next interview and to have things that you can discuss rather than just the fact of, I have a gap and not be able to say more about what you've been doing in the meantime. So some ideas of what you can do now that will look really great to employers and help you address the gaps. Firstly is volunteer. So there are websites out there like volunteermatch.org in which you can find volunteer opportunities inside or outside your industry. It really, doesn't matter if, for example, you volunteer with a local nonprofit or something that may not be directly related to your field. Employers in the US actually really value seeing when candidates sort of give back or take part actively in their community. So this is very valuable, and it really helps you demonstrate you've been keeping, busy, you've been keeping active. So that's one thing to consider. Next, coursework. You could take a course to update your skills, especially if you have a longer gap. I would encourage this, and just wanted you to remember as an Upglow participant, you have access to Coursera for free. Once you complete your core training on WeGlow, you should receive that access within, I believe it's 15 days. And completing a course is a really great way to impress employers to show that you've been keeping your skills and knowledge up to date and to have that to discuss in an interview. And then lastly, just staying up to date in your industry in general. Are there any academic journals that you can read? Any professional associations or groups that you can join? There are websites you can look at, for this, like meetup.com. Talk to your job advisor about this as well. So if you are active somehow in your profession or self-study through just reading these kinds of, journal entries, articles, being able to discuss this in an interview really shows that you are staying active in your field. And it does impress employers and shift focus away from the fact that you may not have had a job, but you are keeping your knowledge up to date. You're very active, and it is impressive. And lastly, I just wanted to mention, while today we are discussing how to address the gap in interviews, you can, and I encourage you to work with your job advisor at Upglow on how to best position your resume to address that gap. And so that's something we, as an Upglow job advisor, will work with you on when we're focusing on your resume. So if you are concerned about a gap, definitely talk to your job advisor to also situate your resume in a way that shows what you've been doing in the meantime. So I'd like to now do an exercise and ask you to enter your responses into the chat of what makes this a weak answer. So let's say, hypothetically, in an interview, this candidate has been asked, what have you been doing since your last job? And they give the response, my husband got a job in the US, so I left my job in my country and we moved here. I took time off to care for my 3 children who are ages 2, 5, and 9. They needed my help to make the move easier, and I had to enroll them in new schools. I've been really busy caring for them. So what do you think makes this a weak answer? If you can enter your answers into the chat. And if you feel uncomfortable entering your answers into the chat, you can always just think of your answer, have it in mind, and I'll give half a minute for you to either think of your answer or please enter it into the chat box as well. Okay, so the main reason why this would be considered a weak answer is because it includes too much personal detail. So remember, you do not want to give personal detail. You want to keep it broad. And so the specifics of, my husband got a job, so I left mine. I took time off to care for my 3 children who are ages 2, 5, and 9. That's too much detail. I've been really busy caring for them. I had to enroll them in new schools. That's also too much detail. You want to keep the answer broad, and you want to shift focus onto what you've been doing professionally or volunteering, right? Coursework, anything related to your field. And you want to end on a note of you being ready to get back into your career. So let's go over some strong answers. Here are some sample answers of what we would consider a strong answer for this question to what have you been doing since your last job? One example, I took a career break to be a primary caretaker for my family after immigrating to the United States. During this time, I also volunteered with my local public library. Now I'm ready to restart my career in the United States. That's a strong answer because it doesn't include too much detail, yet it does offer an honest answer into what this candidate has been doing. And they also let them know that they've been volunteering, which, as we mentioned, is considered impressive to employers because it shows that you're giving back to your community, which is very valued in US culture, professionally and outside of kind of professionally. Another answer for another sort of reason is I took time off to immigrate to the United States and waited 6 months until I gained work authorization. During that time, I kept up to date in the field by completing a biomedical visualization course with the University of Glasgow on Coursera, among other courses. I'm excited to apply my previous professional experience and what I learned from this course in biomedical visualization into this job. So these are 2 different reasons why each candidate kind of took time or has a gap, and these are both strong answers. If you have any questions, please enter them into the chat and we will address them at the end. But these are what we would consider strong answers for this question. So that concludes the segment about gaps on the resume. And now I'd like to focus on how to address being overqualified in interviews. So let's start off with what is being overqualified? How do you know if you are overqualified for a job? This is really the main way to tell. If you have skills, education, or experience beyond what is required or preferred or desired for the job position to which you're applying, you are overqualified for that job. That's a really good way of thinking about that, determining if you are or are not overqualified. Let's take a couple examples. First example, if you have a PhD or an MD and the job posting states a bachelor's degree is required and a master's degree is preferred, you are overqualified. Another example is if you have 10 years of experience and the job posting states that 4 years of experience is required, 5 years of experience is preferred, you are overqualified for that job. And why do companies in the US avoid hiring overqualified candidates? You may kind of initially think, right, if I'm overqualified, isn't that a good thing? Won't they be happy that I have more qualifications than what they're looking for and be eager to hire me for that position? Unfortunately, that is not the case in the United States professional culture. And let's talk about why. So the first is unrealistic salary expectations. The the company will, staff or the hiring manager, recruiter, will assume that if you have, for example, a PhD, but they're looking for someone with a bachelor's, your salary expectation for that job will be much higher than what they're actually willing to offer for the job. Because, undoubtedly you have spent much more money and time gaining that educational degree or experience, let's say, compared to a candidate who's much more entry level in their career. So the company assumes that your salary expectations will not be aligned with what they're willing to offer or have budgeted for this position. Now, you may be thinking, well, what if in an interview I let them know that I don't have any salary expectations or that they're low? That's also not a good way to kind of approach it. You want to always do research on the salary for this specific position in that city, or if it's remotely, and really kind of do your research online on websites like glassdoor.com or payscale.com to understand what that position should pay prior to an interview. But you do not want to give them a number that's excessively high or excessively low. So I encourage you to talk to your job advisor about this as well. The next reason is the company assumes the candidate will be bored in the job. So again, using that example, if you have a PhD or an MD and they're looking for candidates with a bachelor's degree kind of level, they'll assume that it's not stimulating or, intellectually kind of, you won't be really interested in what the job responsibilities entail because they're much lower level than what you're used to. And that is something that companies fear, which ties into the next reason. They fear that you'll quit soon because once you find a better job that's more at your level, you will quit this job. They fear that you're only taking this job for a short period of time, and then you'll quit soon after when you find a job at your level. And lastly, they also fear that the candidate may not follow directions or may not, be as comfortable taking kind of responsibilities assigned to them by their manager. Because if a candidate, let's say, has a PhD and the position's asking for a bachelor's, they can come into the job and actually be much more knowledgeable or qualified compared to a manager. Companies fear that the candidate who's overqualified may not take directions well or may push back if they're given directions. So these are really the main fears that companies have in the US and why it is seen as a negative to hire an overqualified candidate. So let's talk now about how you can address these sorts of issues and how you can present yourself in interviews to try to get past this. And again, I encourage you to work with your job advisor on the actual resume cover letter. As an advisor with Upglow, we can help you figure out how to best situate your resume and cover letter when you apply for jobs for which you're overqualified. And so I wanted to pause and do an exercise. Is this candidate with the resume below, the foundation resume, let's say that's not customized yet for this job, are they overqualified for this job? Here's the job description. So you can either enter your answer, what you think, into the chat, or you can also just think about it and hold your answer to yourself. And I'll give you a minute to think about this. Okay, thank you all for responses in the chat and just for considering this. And yes, you're right for those who answered in the chat that unfortunately the candidate is overqualified. So, if you are in this type, if you find yourself in this type of situation, work with your job advisor on preparing your application, your resume and cover letter to help avoid looking so overqualified. There are ways we can help you deal with this, but let's talk about how we can deal with this in interviews as well. So interviewing while you are overqualified. These are some strategies of how to avoid being labeled and as overqualified and being, not considered for the job because you are overqualified. And the first one is always customize your answer during each job interview. If you are overqualified, do not discuss the academic degree, the skills, or the experience, like the number, for example, of years of experience that you have that make you seem overqualified and are not relevant for this job. So if you in fact have 10 years of experience and they're asking for, let's say, a professional with 5 or 6 years of experience, you do not want in the interview to emphasize that you have 10 years of experience. Instead, I would recommend not mentioning the years of experience that you have. If you have a master's and they ask for a high school degree, diploma required, bachelor's degree preferred, do not discuss in the interview the fact that you have a master's degree. And so this is particularly relevant for many of the common interview questions, like tell me about yourself, or why should we hire you, or what are the top 3 skills that you have that make you such a good fit for this job, or what are your strengths, right? All of those types of questions, you do not want to discuss degrees, skill set, or the level of experience you have that may make you seem overqualified. Instead, discuss what is relevant, what they are asking for, and what you have in relation to what they're asking for. What degree, what experience, what skill set. When I say skill set, that can be hard skills like software or knowledge of certain kind of let's say in healthcare, knowledge of medical terminology or the like. It can also be soft skills. A lot of job postings mention strong time management or organizational skills. So you always want to customize your answer to really emphasize what you have and what they're looking for. Use the job description as your guide. Next, so really discussing only what's relevant. We kind of went over that. Tell your story in a way that makes sense to the interviewer. So think of it this way, right? The interviewer is probably thinking, why did this candidate apply for this job? And you have to be prepared to discuss why you're interested in this job rather than a higher level job. So for example, do you have a certain degree, but maybe you don't have a license or credential in the US? Are you looking to transition your career from one area of healthcare to another? Have you taken recent coursework, to help you transition your career, for example? And so you have to sort of let them know the reason why you are applying for this job rather than a job that is much higher level. And we will talk about some sample answers that you can give that will help you tell your story in a way that makes sense to them. So how would you respond in an interview to the question, are you overqualified for this job? And that question can be asked in so many different ways, but essentially that's the core of the question. Are you overqualified? Why are you applying? You're clearly overqualified. So firstly, again, it is important to be honest and not to just think of a reason that is not truthful that you think they want to hear. Be honest and admit that you are overqualified. You don't need to hide that necessarily, right? Because clearly, even if you have customized your resume, they may be able to really tell you are overqualified. But you can emphasize your long-term commitment to this job specifically, that you will be intellectually stimulated and really committed and excited about this job and or this company, right? And so they want to see that level of, even though this person may be overqualified, they will not be bored by the job. They will be invested, they will be excited, and they will really apply themselves fully to the job rather than, kind of slide by, think it's boring, and really not perform well in the job. You can also use the phrase, I'm restarting my career in the US. I mean, that's a great way, great phrase to kind of let them know that you are ready to take this next career step, but it is in a different country. And so that's a great reason to give to employers that will help them understand your situation. And lastly, you always want to emphasize your interest in working with their company, because if you emphasize the reasons why you're so interested in working with their company long term, it gives them the sense that you will not just work with them for 4 or 5 months until you find a better job with a different company that's more at your level. So you really want to emphasize that you're invested in working with their company long term. Okay, so let's go through a sample interview question and answer. So this is an example of a strong interview answer to the question, you're clearly overqualified for this job. Why did you apply for this position? So a strong answer would be, even though I hold an MD, I am not a licensed doctor in the United States. Now, I am looking forward to applying my knowledge of medicine combined with my knowledge of clinical research gained from my recently completed coursework with Citi to restart my career in the US. I see myself in clinical research long term, and I'm very interested in working with UC San Francisco because it's a leading health sciences university where I envision myself building my career in clinical research within an academic setting. I'm drawn to the academic setting as I have experience in medical research at the University of Tangier. This is an example of a strong answer. And I just want you to take a moment to think, why is it a strong answer? What makes it such a strong answer? And let's talk about that. So first of all, they try to tell their story in a way that makes sense. So from the perspective of the interviewer, they're letting them know, even though I have an MD and my experience may be as a physician, I'm not licensed in the US. And that starts to make more sense to the interviewer. And then they talk about why they're applying for this job, that they're looking forward to actually using their knowledge of medicine in clinical research with those courses they just took. And they really just want to transition their career fully into clinical research. That starts to make sense to the interviewer. Okay, so even if this person has experience in medicine and clinical practice, I understand now, as an interviewer, right, why this person may want to transition into clinical research and why they have applied for this job. So the reason why it's a strong answer includes the fact that this person is telling the interviewer, why their story of why they're applying for this specific job. And they're also focusing on the UC San Francisco, the employer, and why they really want to work there long term, because they're drawn to that academic setting. They have experience in research in an academic setting, and they're making it seem like they want to stay there long term. Okay, so let's talk about some do's and don'ts. And this is actually the final slide. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the chat, and we will get to that section shortly and really go through some of your questions. So overall, when you're thinking of how to address being overqualified in an interview. Some things to do incorporate that you are planning on staying in this job long term. Now, even if you're not planning on staying in the job long term, you still want to give the impression that you are planning on staying there long term. And so keep that in mind, and we'll discuss that in the do nots. Next, what your reasons are for applying. So remember, tell your story in a way that makes sense. If you are overqualified and you have extensive experience, they will want to really understand and to know why this job, why not a job at a higher level. So you really have to think through your answers of why, and express to them in the interview why you are applying specifically for this job rather than a job at a higher level. And lastly, you have to give them the assurance that you are invested in this job and stimulated by it. So just keep that in mind as we discussed, that you will be, really invested, intellectually stimulated by the jobs, that you enjoy performing these types of responsibilities. And so that helps them understand, okay, if we hire them, they're not going to be bored. They will apply themselves and be very invested in the job. So moving on to the do nots. Now, these are some things you should not do in the interview if you're overqualified. You do not want to in any way tell the interviewer that this job is a good starting point, or that you're hoping to get promoted soon after starting this position. So in the interview, if you give an answer that says, I'm very interested in working in this job, and then, I see myself soon after, because I have, an MD or a PhD, moving to like a higher level position. Or you don't want to say, yeah, this job, it's a good place for me to start for now. And because I am restarting my career in the US. So it's a good starting point for now. You do not want to express it that way. If you do, it will give them the impression that you are planning on leaving the job shortly after starting. And that is something you want to avoid. You want to give them the impression you are planning on staying long-term. You are not thinking of this job as a starting point, but instead you are really invested in the job, and you plan on staying long-term. And also, keep in mind, when it comes to promotions generally, companies usually let candidates kind of within the first month after starting a job, kind of examine their performance. And usually promotions don't happen in the US professional culture within the first 6 months. So keep that in mind in general. And you would not want to express or expect that within, for example, 3 months of starting, you would get promoted. So next, tell the interviewer that you're committed to a different career path. You do not want to do this. So if you are applying for a job in medical research, let's say, but you are also taking the USMLEs and applying for residency, or you're planning on earning your degree in, Master of Public Health or another area, you do not want to bring that up in the interview. You want to just focus on giving them the impression that you're committed to the job in this career pathway. If you give them the impression that this job is just for the meantime, and that you will actually be applying, that your main goal is outside of this field, outside of this job position and with this company, that is a reason that, they would not hire you, because they want to hire someone who will stay long-term. It takes a lot of time for and really staff hours for companies to make a hire, for jobs at the company. So it's important that they hire someone, in their minds who will stay a while. So it is important you give that impression. And lastly, don't take it personally. So this is just a part of US professional culture in which candidates who are overqualified, it's seen as a negative and not a positive. So don't take it personally. And we're here to help you as job advisors to best situate your resume and cover letter for jobs for which you're applying, and to help you practice in mock interview sessions for these interviews. Also keep in mind, we have some really great mock interview events virtually. Once you finish your foundation resume and those one-on-ones with your job advisor, you'll start to be invited to those events. And those mock interview events are great ways to practice as well. So we're here to help you get through and overcome this barrier, and to give you one-on-one insight and advice into how to deal with this situation. But ultimately, don't take it personally. This is just a factor or characteristic about US professional culture. Okay, so that concludes all the content that I had that we wanted to discuss today. And now we're going to open it up for questions for you. So please enter your questions into the chat box and we'll take them one by one.
Hello, we got some questions, Layla. Osvaldo asked, how convenient or pertinent is it to point out our recent immigration situation?
That's a great question. So I think if it depends really on the person's situation. If the reason why you maybe have a gap in experience is because you were waiting for work authorization, you do not have to let them know your visa status at all. But I would recommend incorporating, when you're discussing that gap, that you took some time, X amount of months, let's say, to actually gain work authorization. And that's a very valid reason for having a gap on your resume. But I wouldn't recommend offering any information about your immigration status in an interview unless you're applying for, let's say, a government or county job. I believe only government jobs may require US citizenship, or other types of jobs that have some sort of security clearance. That would be pertinent to mention, for example, if you meet that requirement. Otherwise, I would not recommend mentioning your immigration status, your visa status. And we do actually have you right at the top of your resume, fully work authorized, no visa sponsorship required. That's really what companies need to know ultimately about your work authorization status.
Thanks, Layla. That's a great answer. I would just, put it in also with the idea that you just don't want the emphasis in the interview to be on your personal life, but more on your professional situation, without lying or without being difficult, but just really getting the focus on who you are, what your skills and experience are. Another question we got that's a very good one. When asked where to see yourself in the next 5 years, should you show the interviewer that you will still be committed and invested in that job?
I can take on this question. I like this question a lot. So it always depends on the job. Let's say you are interviewing for a contract job or for a temporary job that is, let's say, only 3 or 6 months with no potential for extension or transition into a permanent role. So this is important. If you're interviewing for a contract job and you know that there's a chance of extending or a transition into permanent, you definitely would like to I would definitely like to show your interest in the role, and especially in the company. So show your passions, show your knowledge about the company and your commitment. If this role does not offer an extension, it's just a few months, you should also emphasize that in 5 years you may see yourself somewhere else, but for now this is a great role for you where you would like to contribute, where you see yourself as an asset. Otherwise, you don't want to be overcommitted. So if you are being interviewed for just a temporary role, the company does not seem to have the appearance that you will be bored because you were actually looking for something else. They want someone who is committed for this time of period. But if they offer a longer permanent role, yes, definitely show that you're committed in this job for the next 5 years. And especially in professional development in this direction, show that you're learning in this area, in this field, and that you're very excited to utilize your knowledge long term. Not sure what my other colleagues' opinion is about that.
I think you covered it, Patty. I think that's a great points. And I think you don't have to give too much detail with this type of answer. If it's like a regular employment type job that's at will, without a contract, I always just recommend using that wonderful phrase, I'm looking forward to growing at the company, taking on more responsibilities, just to show that you have that goal of professional development and in mind, that you are eager to grow in your career. But I think it is good to indicate that you still see yourself with their company.
Great answers and questions. Here's another question. Could the pandemic be a somewhat good reason for a gap?
I can start, but I'm sure other advisors have a lot to say about this too. Absolutely. During especially the beginning and peak of the pandemic, as we all know, there was a huge economic impact to many industries and many companies, and also impacted candidates who were actively looking for a job. And so that is something that recruiters and hiring managers understand. Since then, many industries have bounced back and there are many jobs available, but I think that it certainly explains a big piece of the puzzle of why someone may have gotten fired, laid off, or if you were in the job search, that it was more difficult for you to land a job because of the pandemic. And I'm sure others have some more to add.
I agree with that. Definitely, because we were all all impacted, and it did cause a delay in in everything that we did. Our entire situation we're on hold, so this definitely can be a good reason. Perfectly, what I recommend to my job seekers to still connect with your situation. Don't just say due to the pandemic I was not able to apply. Maybe connected in saying due to pandemic that impacted my personal situation, including childcare for my children, I was no longer able to focus on my job search. Something that it does not sound like you're using the reason just like others. That's my opinion. That's how I recommend to job seekers.
I agree with both my colleagues, and I would just add, once again, not to make a big emphasis on it. I mean, most people are aware, that we've all experienced this national situation. So you don't want to get too stuck in it, but you certainly, if asked, can say, although I've been working on my job search, things have slowed down during the pandemic, and I've been involved also in, taking care of my family, something like that. But, you don't, once again, you just don't want to get the interview sidetracked off why you're a good fit for the job.
Absolutely agree. And I think, in healthcare, I know that for many folks, personal safety was top of mind, particularly before the rollout of the vaccine and with different surges that we saw, and so I think if that was a factor, for example, impacting you working in your profession, you can certainly mention it. But like Tamar and Patty were saying, place the emphasis on what you've been up to in the meantime. And, that can be volunteering, coursework, reading up on in academic journals or self-study to keep up to date in your field. Really focus on what you've been doing during that time, rather than just focusing your time and the answer on the pandemic.
So those are all the questions that I see in the chat. Does anyone else have a question they'd like to add or that I missed?
You can also unmute yourself if you are walking or driving, or you'd like to ask a question as well. But we have one here. When it comes to salary, I understand there are a lot of variables. Is there an average that we can consider acceptable? So in order to have a stable situation, so there isn't an average really across the board. It really entirely depends on the job position itself, the city and state in which you're living. And of course, now we have a lot more remote jobs as well. But I think it's essential to do research on what this type of job should pay. And with this type of company, is it a private company? Is it a nonprofit, public health organization? That's also a factor, a variable. The city in which it's based is a variable, because there are so many different average cost of living, average cost of rent and housing. So I wouldn't say that there is really a standard across the board that I could give you, for example, when it comes to salary. I think it's important to do research on websites like PayScale and Glassdoor. I can put those in the chat, and I'll let my colleagues jump in.
No, I think you covered it quite well. It's about doing the research, trying to get as much information, and then also understanding your situation and knowing what you need to make to support that. That's the other side. But you need to know what is traditional for the market, for the position.
Absolutely. And do we have any additional questions that anyone would like to ask? You can enter them in the chat. You can also unmute yourself. We have 5 minutes left. Okay, so it looks like we do not have any further questions. And as I've been saying in the webinar, I really encourage you to reach out to your job advisor for support when it comes to preparing your job application or your interview kind of practice, preparing ahead of time for the interview to really address these issues. But we're hoping that with the information we presented today, it's given you a sense of strategies that you can use, the reasons why, behind why, US professional culture is the way it is, but turn to your job advisor for support. Thank you all for attending.